the investment community in helping Africa really take that leap into the digital age, modernize industry, education, and government setting the right framework to do so. So leading us in the conversation is Abdu Mukhtar. He's the Director for Industry and Trade and Development at the African Development Bank. They have done extensive research on the subject, and this morning they're going to use this platform to tell us a little bit about their research report and launch it. And then from some of the points that are being made, I'm hoping it will set the tone for us to have a dynamic conversation. So Abdu Mukhtar, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending this, in my view, the most important session at the AIF. It's an honor for me to be here today to introduce the important session on unlocking digital investments. And it gives me great pleasure to launch a significant new report, Unlocking the Potential of the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Africa, produced by the African Development Bank with support from the Korea-Africa Economic Cooperation Fund. Digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, big data analytics, blockchains, 3D printing, are already upon us. They not only create productivity gains, they fundamentally can change what Africa can do. The report is a response to the increased attention being given to technology in our lives. It assesses where Africa stands now in its adoption of the fourth industrial revolution, and importantly, identifies opportunities and challenges that Africa faces as it competes globally. It uses country studies, sector analysis, and technology briefs to define the business case for widespread adoption of 4IR. There is clearly significant activity already in digital transformation of the continent, and much of the transformation is being supported by technologies covered in the report. Some of the key findings of the report include: one, we see the Internet of Things, so-called IoT and big data as currently the technology areas with the highest utility in Africa. IoT is, of course, a key data gathering technology, and it is understandable that investment is being made in this area. In fact, the IoT market is expected to reach a value of $12.6 billion in 2021. Second, not only will these technologies have the potential to seed entirely new industries, but they also have the ability to transform traditional sectors by dramatically improving productivity. Farming is a key example, where the Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence, and drones can enable smart, precise, and more productive agriculture to help ensure that we can feed Africa's growing population and consign hunger to the past. Three, as elsewhere in the world, there are challenges to be addressed if Africa is going to compete in 4IR. Connectivity is still incomplete in rural areas, affecting the quality of data and the reach of services. Policy and regulatory frameworks are still in development and are yet to address regional data flows. Finance is not always readily accessible to entrepreneurs, and incubators and hubs are of inconsistent quality. In addition, key skills are in short supply. I'm happy to say, though, that the African Development Bank is systematically addressing these challenges through investments we are making in private and public sector, in the private and public sector. Fourth, the study identified in 2019 about 6,500 technology startups across the continent, among which more than 10% are developing 4IR applications. They received $210 million in venture capital investments of the overall $2.27 billion investments in technology startups. There are real investable business cases out there already. In summary, the report clearly shows a continent that is adopting and embracing the fourth industrial revolution. This is important. It is not behind the rest of the world, as has been the case with past industrial revolutions. It is very much in a position to compete and innovate. Panels such as the one that we are hosting today with such a highly distinguished composition will allow us not only to address prospective road bumps along the way, but just as importantly, highlight the successes we have here in Africa. Finally, I want to thank everybody who has worked very hard to make sure that this report has been produced. Our Vice President, Pierre Ghislaine, one of the panelists, who's been a strong advocate and champion of ICT on the continent from several years and decades of his past work, Nick Williams, our ICT manager, Tiano Diaro, the officer in charge to make this happen. The report is now officially launched, and you can pick your copies at the back of the room and elsewhere, and we have it also on the internet. So bottom line is think 4IR, think Africa. Thank you very much. I now hand over to the panel.
Thank you very much, Abdu. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lerato Mbele, and I am a presenter on BBC World Television. I host Talking Business Africa and a variety of other business-related content. And I have to tell you, increasingly, business content on the international media, as pertaining to Africa, is everything to do with startups, innovation, and tech. So this is a really timely conversation because it truly reflects what's happening on the ground in the African continent. As Abdu has just said, we're not really playing catch-up anymore. It's really about making technology work for Africa's development. Now, I recently came across a thesis on Twitter. Is it a thesis if it's on Twitter? It's a thesis. And it's something that Vala Shah had written. And he basically said, in the old world, oil was the most valuable commodity. In the new world, data is the most prized commodity. And it's everything to do with data, from data storage to data analytics. Those are the things that will be game changers for any business in any industry in the world we live in. Now, when I saw that, I was struck by it, but I was also a little bit concerned because I thought, it means I'm still living in the old world because I keep thinking oil remains king. And yet we're being told we're very much in the new world where data is king. So just by way of understanding or getting a sense of your sentiment around this digital age, I'm going to run a random poll. Just by a show of hands, please be honest. How many of you are concerned about this brave new world that is upon us? I am. And I'd like our panel to have a good look. And the minister, at least she's honest. So a few of us are concerned about the brave new world. How many of you are excited about this brave new world? Who believes that the kind of innovations we're hearing about, that we're seeing, and I'm talking here things like driverless cars, hydroponics, battery-powered buses, fintech. How many of you believe these are relevant for Africa's development trajectory? We've just heard Abdu's report, and in it he used some terms, Internet of Things. He referred to artificial intelligence, robotics, algorithms. How many of you believe these things, these tools for data, are going to make you redundant? I said, let's be honest. Shall I repeat that question? Will you search your soul? Algorithms, robotics, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. How many of you are going to lose your job because of these things? There's very few honest people in this room. And who believes that transforming your business using tech and digital tools will help to protect your business and the industry at large? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, you get a sense of how the audience feels. So let me introduce you to our panel. At the furthest end is the Honourable Minister of Communications and ICT in the Republic of South Africa, Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams. You're welcome, Minister. Seated next to her is Mr. Solomon Assefa, who's the Vice President for IBM Research, leading in the Africa and the emerging market solution space. Thank you very much for your time, Solomon. Seated next to Solomon is Gary Schneider, who's the Managing Director for Global Public Sector at Citigroup. Gary, thank you for your time. Rob Shooter is the Group Chief Executive for MTN. Thank you so much, Rob. Seated next to Rob is Oliver GL, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Hello Tractor. Thanks so much for your time. And also Pierre Gislan, who is the Vice President for the Private Sector, Infrastructure and Industrialization at the African Development Bank. And Pierre was also the co-chair of the Africa or AU-EU Digital Economy Task Force. So they've been doing a lot of work in this space. So let's start with you, Minister. reflecting on what the audience has told you, the fears about the future, but the excitement, how do you feel?
I feel that as the policymaker, it means we have lots of work to do, especially if people are not certain about the future, as no one is certain about the future that we're talking about. We've never lived it. It's the first time that we're all getting into it. But as a responsible policymaker, mine is to say, how do I make sure that I allay fears from my people whilst I'm introducing the technologies, because we all have to be there. That talks to the effective policy environment that we must create, regulatory imperatives that must be introduced, but most importantly, working together with the private sector. And then not just private sector and government, but also the public, to make sure that we really get to understand what are the concerns, why are they concerned, and then we then come up with solutions together, not government doing it for them, but together we're coming together to say, this is what we think is best for South Africa.
We'll talk about those solutions in a second. Solomon Asefa, you're kind of the brains here. You're the techie here. Just help us. And okay, you too, Rob. You too. But when you see a handful of people saying, I'm concerned about my future, I'm concerned that I'm going to have a job, how do you respond?
I'm very optimistic about trends in technology. We have seen it many times in the past as well. But I think we need to cut through a lot of the hype and try to understand exactly what this revolution means and what exactly is happening, right? So yes, you often hear, data is the new oil, but, in our context, right, do we have the right type of data? Do we have, the right representative type of data to actually make these algorithms work, right? So we got to really cut through that and try to understand, what are these technologies and what opportunities can it unlock? And I really believe that it could, in the sectors that are the most important for us, be it in agriculture, be it in healthcare, be it in, power, energy, be it in government digital transformation. I do think that the tools that are coming out, the data that's also being available publicly as well as from private sector, can have a lot of impact, but people also need to be able to transform themselves, the skills that they have and how they utilize these tools.
So not just technology for technology's sake. Gary, there is a question I asked here, which is, what kind of transformation, the tools that are needed, would save an industry from becoming obsolete? So when you're speaking to regulators, because you have the opportunity of straddling both sides, the private sector and the regulators, what are the tools right now that shape this new course?
Well, there's a lot of tools out there. I think it goes back to some of the things we've already heard. And, how do we get everybody ready to participate in this economy? The economy's changing. Even in the United States, in the city that I grew up in, there was, a very large industry that went away, and then the city had to change, and they invested a lot of money through grants and through education to revitalize the entire city. That it went from a very manufacturing-based economy to a digital economy, but that all came from the government, the local government, and the federal government actually engaging with the industry, both the healthcare industry and the academic company, large academic universities in the city, to really make a change. And it brought people in, and it kept people there and spawned lots of new industries. Right. And how does that happen here?
Rob, operationally, because you're really at the coalface, you are working with these technologies, experimenting with these technologies, speaking to consumers. What are the kinds of things that will really empower the African consumer? We heard those terms, the Internet of Things, you're in that space, robotics, algorithms. What are the sorts of things we should embrace as African consumers?
Well, I think we still have a lot of opportunity just in general connectivity. If we look at the MTN customer base across these markets, out of our 244 million customers, only roughly 1/3 are connected to the mobile internet. And most of those customers don't have other options in terms of fixed line, Wi-Fi, because of the infrastructure backlog we've got across the continent. And there's lots of studies also around how access to the internet, broadband connectivity also stimulates GDP growth. So I think we need to acknowledge that we need to still focus on maybe we now call basic infrastructure. The mobile networks need to be rolled out much deeper, much wider. They themselves have a reliance on things like electrification, transport, roads, etc. And now we can increasingly overlay on top of that the kind of digital services that will make a difference, which I think is at the heart of your question. And I think one of the most profound is basically financial services, fintech, mobile financial services, because we also have challenges around the distribution of the formal banking system in the continent.
Yeah.
So if we can connect people to the world through connectivity and connect them to the economies through mobile financial services, then everything else opens up, which is the business opportunities.
Jahil, adding on to what Rob has said, you've innovated in the agriculture space, creating a kind of an Uber business for farmers, right? That's a simpler way of putting it. Just tell us where else we unlock the opportunity for the every man and every woman.
Well, we're an IoT company. We collect data at the tractor level that provides insights to stakeholders across our ecosystem. I think the most valuable use of that data is to crowd in additional investment, information de-risks, transactions for banks, for non-banking financial institutions.
He's in the tech economy. He's in the tech economy.
My friend Ndabeni in the front. And I think the frontier, the next frontier for our platform, and I think for a lot of companies, and where you see value immediately, is using these insights to unlock more capital, because these are capital constrained economies, and the sector that we work in, agriculture, is certainly capital constrained, and information is a great way to illustrate to institutional investors, public sector, DFIs, that this is a sector worth investing in, and here are the facts that should guide your investment decisions.
Pierre, you whispered to me whilst we were doing this random poll that it's clear everybody's an optimist. Why should we be optimists?
Well, when you look at the main driver of change in Africa over the past 2 decades, I think ICT has definitely been one of them. The mobile revolution here, look at connectivity on the continent 20 years ago, look at it today. It's just not comparable. And it's not just voice or text, it's mobile financial services. It's been expanding and expanding. So if there's one industry in Africa that has shown that it was innovative, it was able to develop, to grow, to challenge vested interests, it's definitely the technology industry. If you look, for example, at VC capital raised in Africa last year, was the highest ever, I think twice the amount of the previous year. So I think it's definitely a continent that is open to technology, a continent that's open to innovation, but also a continent that needs to constantly be challenged, and where technology and innovation need to challenge vested interests. But that, to me, remains a big issue.
All right, so let's move beyond the philosophical and start talking about the investment opportunities. This is an investment conference after all. So the World Bank in a report said that between now and 2030, we would need $100 billion in order to connect close on to 1 billion Africans to some kind of technology. So to unlock that 100 billion, what needs to happen? Because right now some of this money sits as pledges. We're talking real, tangible capital. Where is it and how can it be unlocked? Gary, you look to me like you're ready to say something.
Thank you. Projects are hard to find. And how do you create policy, and how do you create an investment environment that's friendly? And we've seen it done in some places through tax policy, or incentivizing people to come in, or incentivizing public-private partnerships. We've seen a lot of them try. Not all of them are successful. It's hard to get done, but changing laws that allow for people to come in and be a tax-free zone for a period of time is a way to attract capital. Most of the companies here are not already investment grade. There's no research being done on them today. So it's hard for people to raise their hand and say, I'm going to take the risk and come in, for all the macro issues as well as the financial issues. So I think, back to the policy side, not just for ICT, but government-wide, how do you create incentives? You know, zones that if you invest in this zone, you get a tax-free income for a period of years, which we've seen work in places.
Rob, I know you want to add to that, and Pierre as well. Please do, because we hear that there is a lot of innovation happening on the ground in Africa, but it's that match between venture capital and technology that can be rolled out. That's where we've got the disconnect.
I think I wanted to make perhaps a point that the regulatory and policy environment we've had in the last 20 years has actually been very successful. The point that was made earlier. Because, you know, historically, things like, you know, fixed line infrastructure, energy, transport was fundamentally controlled by the public sector, the old fixed line incumbents. And I think the continent took a different route 20, 25 years ago, and they decided to license a limited number of telcos to roll out mobile networks with affordable licenses, long licenses, spectrum. And so we sit here today that, you know, 95% of the continent is covered for voice. Competition has made those prices very affordable, and we have a, you know, well invested sector. We participated in that report that you're quoting from, and in fact, the mobile industry in Africa has spent around $10 billion a year, of which MTN, in fact, is about 20% of that, $2 billion a year. And you know, $10 billion up until 2030 from today is a big part of the $100 billion that they quote in the report. So I think what's very important is to let's take what worked from the last 25 years and also push it into the next 20. You know, access to spectrum at affordable rates will help a lot. Long-term licenses, because it's a long-term industry, and particularly, you know, partnerships with public and private sector around the hard-to-reach parts of the continent. You know what we call the last 10%. So that last 10% is the most difficult one to cover, and that's not an emerging market issue only. Even in the developed market, you see problems attacking that last bit. And I think there we have to be creative around what kind of financing solutions can we find to make it bankable for infrastructure projects for that part of the market.
Minister, I'm coming to you. Pierre, money, 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 money. We want to see it. It's there, but it's not coming into digital innovation in Africa. Pourquoi?
Well, if you ask me, I've been asking ICT operators for the last few years, please come to us if you have any investment project you want us to finance. They're not coming, right? They're not coming because by and large, they have their ways of financing and they don't need our money. So what we need, so sometimes governments want to come to us, but governments then want to create their own public sector networks. The track record of that has not been too great. So I think what we need to find is a bit of a new model to see how can we push the market beyond where it is today. I think private companies have done a great job. How do we get them to go beyond that, to go to that last mile, etc.? And so there, you know, the time has come to shift our mindset from what was the one we had like 20, 25 years ago, which helped create this mobile revolution, and to create a new one for a digital revolution. And that means opening up the sector, getting other actors in, but also moving much more from national regulation to regional and continental regulation. Data is global, flows globally, and the longer we keep working with 54 small markets, the harder it is it will get to deploy capital at scale. But my big issue right now is we are not, as a bank, we are not being asked for financing in this sector.
We'll talk about financing. I want to bring in the minister here because she wanted to jump in earlier. A few things have been said about regulators in general, creating the enabling environment, creating a competitive environment, and just sorting out some licensing issues, spectrum, the likes. What are you doing?
I think it's very important to appreciate the changes that we've seen over the years. As Rob said, we're coming from a voice-centric regime, which means the legislations and the regulations that we produce were meant for that. Now, as governments, we are appreciative of the fact now it's a data-centric regime, which calls for overhauling of all the policies and regulations that we have. Because we're still going to experience lots of challenges wherein the regulator does not understand what needs to be done because they're not tech-savvy, but key to that is that we talk to in South Africa, the importance of coordination, understanding who does what in your space and the capabilities that your people have, not necessarily as the public, but the innovators and all that. Rob mentions a very important point, that in South Africa we've done well in the past years. We need to learn and take whatever that worked in those past 25 years to the future. At the same time, I add to what you're saying, we also need to unlearn certain tendencies, whereby, for example, here in South Africa, we'll be talking of, it's not only South Africa, by the way, we're talking of a saturated market or highly concentrated market to say, how do we then make sure that we diversify? As the telcos you see now, they're talking about venturing into financial services and everything else because of the technological advancement. How do we work together, build a brave private sector, and of course, a reliable government that must understand that as the private sector drives its own work, government will be there to back up in terms of the regulatory environment and the incentives that
I want to stay with you a little bit, Minister, and this is not a problem unique to South Africa. I appreciate that. But there's so many unknowns. You said that yourself. And because there's so many unknowns, across the continent, there isn't really a 4IR policy framework. It's still in formulation. And a lot of companies that are in the space, they're just operating on legal principle, what lawyers will defend and not defend. But in terms of policy that maps the space, it doesn't exist. Now, we're speaking to investors. They want clarity. How soon can they get clarity? How quickly and urgently is this government working, and how are others, to your knowledge, working on the African continent to get the correct policy framework?
The first thing that we did as the African states was to make sure that we develop our own digital transformation system, framework, that we must all adhere to, and that's giving guidance to say what is it that we intend to look in as we talk about the digital transformation in Africa. Here in South Africa, we recently met the Presidential Commission on 4IR last week with the President, whereby they're drafting a document or a plan for the country to say, South Africa, these are the identified technologies and areas that we must focus in. Of course, leveraging on what we grade on, your manufacturing, your agriculture, and other industries that we say we can really get value from. But as I said, if we can come up with those plans, if we're not working together and we're not bold enough and brave to say, it doesn't matter if we're looking at the rand now that it's not doing very well, but we do have confidence in the next 5 years things will change because of the technologies and whatever other innovations that the private sector can bring on board. And as government, as I said, we are confident about one thing. If we work together, our interest is to serve the people of this country and make sure that we turn around our economy. Therefore, the best policies and legislations, as guided by the partnership between government and the private sector, will be implemented faster, which is something that we are considering. Currently, our laws take 18 months to produce in Parliament, and we have said there's a need for us to change that. That talks to capacity building for the legislators themselves to understand the space that we're operating in, regulatory environment and all that.
Pierre, just for you to comment to this, because of the work you've been doing with the African Union and the EU, how quickly are other governments in Africa rolling out 4IR digitization programs and policies?
So clearly it's a top priority for many governments. And so what we tried to do in this African Union, European Union task force, kind of take stock of the lay of the land, where are we at, where are the challenges, and see also how we can develop a partnership between Europe and Africa, and that, of course, is open to others as well, to help build, I would say, the soft infrastructure that will make that possible. Because I don't think financing is going to be the main issue. The main issue is putting in place these new regulations, finding ways to do things more at regional and continental level, and these things are hard to do. They're not easy to do.
I want to go back to the investment case, and I want to bring you in here, GL. A lot of the innovation we see, a lot of the people coming up with apps are startups. That's the level at which we're seeing the innovations on the African continent. But because startups are small caps to a large extent, the big money that's needed, this 100 billion I've spoken about, is not going to reach you. And the question now is, how do small businesses tap into the capital that's available? What are your observations? What have you learned?
Well, my knee-jerk response is that the startup ecosystem is undercapitalized on the continent. The opportunity is huge, but that narrative is getting old, and with small amounts of capital chasing a large volume of deals, obviously, supply and demand dynamics, the price of money goes up. So if you're a company trying to position yourself as we are, as a $1 billion company one day, and you take in capital that's expensive, you run out of balance sheet and you don't become a $1 billion company. You become a company with no equity to offer the marketplace after your Series B. And my advice to startups on this continent is don't fool yourself into thinking that a VC is your friend. You tighten your belt and you figure out a way to execute on your technology stack and your business plan through partnerships. This is something that we've been very fortunate to be able to establish partnerships with companies like IBM and John Deere and Bosch and some of the top companies on earth to supplement the spending so we're not having to go into this expensive capital market and finance ourselves, because any VC in the room, if we have any, who's investing at 4x top line revenue, you're not interested in investing in technology and building unicorns. Right. It's just too expensive. And that's, maybe I'm getting a little too technical, I'm a finance guy, but it just does not create the kind of growth and success stories that we see in better capitalized venture markets.
Solomon, I don't know whether you want to add to this, and in fact, anybody else. I mean, as I said earlier, there needs to be some kind of a Silicon Valley type formula where the innovation is in close proximity to the venture capital. Because if we're looking at sovereign funding at the government level, it's not coming to the people who are actually doing the innovation. So how do we get this money here? Even the pension funds, they have prescribed assets, but how do we try to bring that money here?
I think Jahil already touched on it, but from our side, what we're seeing is, some of the big companies, be it IBM or MTN or others, they're also becoming platform players, right? So we develop a lot of tools that are going to be consumed by, the startups, right? And, we're changing our business models so that there will be smart, agile kind of partnerships where, funding will be also on the table, but it's about co-creation, right? So Jahil's company, when we looked at it, is not really just an IoT company. What we saw is it's a company that generates a lot of data. From the data, there will be a lot of insights, and then from the insights, we're able to actually de-risk the whole value chain in the ag play, right? So if we think about it from that perspective, then the initial capital that's required can actually be smaller so that we can scale in a very, very agile manner.
Robbie, you want to say something? Pierre, as well?
Just to say that, there are a number of kind of startup VC accelerator programs running across a number of the geographies we operate in. They're heavily oversubscribed, which I think supports your point that the supply and the demand are out of balance. But the build I wanted to make, just building on the comment around the platform economies, one of the things we're trying to do as MTN is also to provide access. So we ran recently a hackathon where we opened up the APIs on our mobile money platform in a sandbox environment to attract potential startups to see what they could do with, with the kind of information and data and access that was there. And I think that's also part of the puzzle, is how do you create also an environment for people to come up with their ideas and then move into the, the phase of securing funding.
Mm-hmm. On our side, we have financed a number of private equity funds like Tide Africa that invest in technology ventures, but also we have this quite innovative initiative with the European Investment Bank and the European Commission called Boost Africa, where what we do is we finance VC capital funds that invest primarily only in Africa and primarily in technology ventures, largely by young entrepreneurs. And so the way that works, because there is some de-risking to be done, the EU provides us the de-risking layer, and EIB and the African Development Bank provide the equity capital. That is then accompanied by a lab that provides technical assistance and support to these funds and to entrepreneurs. So I think combining capital with advisory services is one way to help accelerate that process.
Okay, so there's no investing without returns. Let's not be naive. So where are the low-hanging fruits in Africa? Where are you likely to see good returns, but also do the social impact thing, which is help Africa connect, help bring people into the mobile economy?
Definitely, if you're talking about the agricultural sector, that's where there's going to be huge investment. Everybody has to have food, a plate, it doesn't matter how often. Secondly, the other one is looks into manufacturing, because you spoke about the capabilities that we have, but also the number of people that we have who are still lagging behind the technological advancements. I always say in South Africa, for example, we have about 20 million unconnected people. That's a market on its own to say you can tap into it, expose those people to your technologies. Our responsibility as government is to make sure that we digital skill them, so that by the time you bring the technologies, they can understand and they can derive the economic spin-off from that. But most importantly, one of the key things, infrastructure is very important, because we need to get people connected, as Rob said. We cannot do as governments, it has been proven. We don't have much muscle on that. Therefore, partnering with the private sector to say, go out, make sure that you do not continue with leaving other people outside the digital divide that we talk about. We need everybody connected so that you can drive both the demand and supply side. And indeed, those that are investing will really see the benefit, whilst the people will be moving to another level. Investing in startups, they've said it. Okay. Making sure that you localize your products. It always works.
I still want to know the low-hanging fruits.
Okay, so I've not responded.
No, you have, but others?
That Rob brought up and the minister brought up is, the rural versus the urban investment. And while this isn't answering your low-hanging fruit, the success of M-Pesa, and you saw how that happened, bringing people into the financial sector changes their lives. And it's not just inclusiveness for the poor, but of gender equality as well. And we've seen great success where that has happened. So how do you reach the last, maybe not the last mile, but the last 10 miles even? And if you have a farmer who wants to buy a tractor or give data to Jahil, they need to have a phone. And we've seen other governments fund phones in places. So is that something that happens? And how do you give them the technology? And all of a sudden, when someone is using their technology not to Twitter or surf the internet, but to do business, to actually say, gee, I'm going to get money coming into my phone. And, and quite often, there's a gender equality of who gets the money.
Yeah.
So if the woman gets the money in the phone, all of a sudden she can start her own business and not giving the money to somebody else. And that spurs other, and there's small little increments, and that's, and that's a focus that people don't always look at. The small business that hires 2 or 3 other people is, there's thousands, potentially millions of those potential. And how do you spur that kind of investment? Well, you need, the Robs and the MTNs of the world to help start the infrastructure. How do you support the small disadvantaged quite often to get engaged?
Right.
And bringing them into the bank. Yes, I'm a banker and I know that, but I'm not being self-serving here, but I truly believe that bringing someone into the banking system early on is a huge benefit to the inclusiveness and success.
Okay, does anybody else want to add to this? Because I want to move the conversation along.
Just building on that, I think we're seeing quite a few startups playing in that space. Startups and digital tools that are actually supporting small and medium enterprises. And there's about 200 or 300 million of them across the African continent, right? So in Kenya, for example, you have Twiga Foods and others that are actually, enabling the small shops understand the turnover that's happening within their shops, connecting them to financing, and then also connecting them to distributors and so forth. So I think that's a low-hanging fruit where a lot of jobs could also be created using these digital tools.
If you look at the real successful digital businesses in the more developed markets, things like Uber, Airbnb, what they did was they took advantage of the fact that people were connected with smartphones, and then they could connect lots of consumers with basically people providing a service. Uber driver is a small business. Airbnb is a small business. So what's going to happen, I think, over the African markets the next 3 to 5 years is that connectivity is going to grow, and the low-hanging fruit is going to be these real scale businesses will pop up. I think agri, absolutely believe, because you have lots of small suppliers and some big consumers who can buy in bulk. Financial services, fintech, for sure, because a lot of these African markets will completely jump over the legacy banking infrastructure we're used to, and will go straight to digital. Right. And finally, infrastructure. We built a whole industry on generating returns and putting infrastructure in to service customers who can only afford around $4 a month. That's basically, so we've come up with a way, I think, working together to provide cost-effective solutions. Most of the major players in the infrastructure game are leveraged. The
Yeah.
telcos are borrowing, the governments are borrowing. So there must be a space there for innovative
Right.
financial products. And maybe just, a slight pushback to my banking colleagues. It's also partly the providers of banking products to be innovative and to come out with innovative solutions for the players.
All right, so I want to introduce the last theme before we go to questions. And I'm going to quote you, Rob Shooter. Yay, quotable quotes. We actually did an interview with him on BBC, and this is what he said. For me, it was mind-blowing, but in any case, here we go. So he says, on the African continent, about 30% of the people are living in a 4G world. Everybody else is living in a 2G and analog world. I found that a staggering statistic, that the majority of people are not even transacting, using their phones in the way in which the middle class and the wealthy are doing, and hence the digital gap that the minister's talking about. So connectivity becomes a real issue, and I think skills then becomes the secondary phenomenon here. How do we attend to this urgently?
To Rob's rescue, because I know we would like to say what I'm going to say, just to save him. Definitely one of the key enablers to what you spoke about is ensuring that we release spectrum on time, because it's also something that contributes in ensuring that the operators can be able to go wherever that they are needed to go to. But as I said, also the incentives that come with the deployment and the obligations that go to the operators themselves, because as we're talking about this, that now most people are on 2G. What happened to the spectrum that we licensed on 3G? Okay, in South Africa, we've delayed on 4G. We recently released the policy direction, but of course we've made a commitment that with the 5G, the minister is leaving for Cairo on Monday to make sure that we sign on the outcomes of the World Radio Conference, and then we've also mandated the regulator to make sure that within 6 months they bring a report to us in terms of the research that must be done, and so that we can work towards developing the policy on 5G like any other country does. The country has to have that, and then it enables now the private sector to say confidently so, because this is what is guiding us, and we understand the incentives and the investment that we're making, and therefore we will be able to go.
Gentlemen, help me here. We're already moving into a world where 5G is being considered, and people don't even have devices that would allow them to participate in just the 4G world. So the gap just seems to be widening. How can we stunt that?
One comment on that, I would say, even in a 2G world, you can actually provide a lot of services, right? So yes, one way to consume a service is through a fancy Mara phone that shows you some, visualization. Another is just a simple text message. So I think we need to think back and say, okay, are we actually consciously making an effort to reach to the people in the rural side that need a text message, a simple text message to tell them, today is not the day to apply your fertilizer, today is not the day to go to, the distribution center or so. The other side of it is actually, even in that context, even using a simple 2G phone is a problem, because there is illiteracy as well. So the skill side that you mentioned is something that we need to address very quickly.
Yes, Pierre?
No, I fully abound in the same direction. I think we tend to focus too much on the glass half empty. I think the glass is really at least half full. You can do a lot with 2G, and African entrepreneurs have shown that you can do much more with 2G than other people thought. Not saying that people shouldn't move to 3 and 4G, etc., and they will, but some things come with a certain level of per capita income. And you also need clean water, you need education, you need access to electricity, and kind of focusing too much, I think, on the ICT or connectivity side may not necessarily be the best policy prescription. We're presenting another report tomorrow, which is on Africa's infrastructure financing gap. And so you have transport, you have energy, you have water, you have ICT. And roughly financing gap per annum are about $100 billion. In that report, the authors estimate the financing gap in ICT to be between 0 and 3 billion. So it is not that big. So the main thing for me is to create the opportunities to build on what we have. And again, I said it before, we need to open up these national markets into regional markets. We need to create broader investable markets so that private sector, when they go into one country, can access the markets in others, that data can flow, and that there's more energy and competition in the system.
Yeah, we came up with a framework a couple of years ago for what is limiting internet adoption in Africa, and the framework is called CHASE, and it's an acronym. So the 5 things are coverage, handsets, affordability, services, and education. And I think the point is that they all need work. So obviously in coverage there's issues around 3G, 4G, spectrum, fiber, etc. And I'm delighted to hear the Minister talking about the spectrum. But of course in many of the other elements, this is where the operators need to do work. The A of affordability, what are we doing to bring down the cost, particularly for the entry-level customers coming into the data world for the first time. Handsets, a big problem in Africa. Think about people spending $4 or $5 a month on the category, and an entry-level smartphone is $40 or $50. It's just, really a problem with affordability, the services, and the education. Now, what's interesting, if we look across the 240 million customers we serve, there's 80 million connected today to using 3G or 4G. There's another 80 million that have 3G or 4G coverage, but aren't accessing the internet, and then and have the right kind of device. And then there's the third that that are struggling with both. So I guess the point is that issues like the right kind of service, the right kind of education, affordable tariffs are actually as important now as rolling out coverage.
Something I haven't heard said on the panel is the infrastructure gap. You referred to it earlier when you spoke about CAPEX and how much mobile operators are having to roll out. But a simple thing like electricity, right? If there's no electricity, what are we even talking about? South Africa, but I won't hold you accountable for that, Minister. But that's a real question across the continent. So what are those interventions that need to be made?
Of South Africa, as you highlighted it. You've seen the minister releasing the IRPP, whereby he's calling also for not just partnerships on renewable energies, but also we're calling for innovations to utilize what is it that we have at home. The reason earlier on when you asked about the low-hanging fruits, I mentioned infrastructure, because I wasn't looking on infrastructure on ICTs. I was looking at the entirety of infrastructure, and that cuts across, which is why in South Africa we've taken a different position to say, let's look into the entire ecosystem. If we need to change laws, if we need to make investment, what are the key areas? Because we may roll out broadband, but if there's no electricity, there's no value in it. Another thing that you spoke about that I would like to go back when you were asking about the digital divide, because as we're talking 4IR in South Africa. We said we want to be one of the leaders in the continent. But crucial to that, we're still rolling out analog services in terms of the television sets, in terms of the cell phones. Therefore, you're still going to see those changes that we're making, whereby we're saying we're banning those feature phones to introduce what Rob referred to, accessible and affordable smartphones, so that as we try to bridge the divide, we also bring people on those technologies. So infrastructure in South Africa, that's why we set up 100 billion, of course it's rands, it's not dollars. That must go to infrastructure. We are working on that, and we're the great country in infrastructure in the continent, nevertheless.
Yeah, so I think development is co-development. You don't develop one part by itself if the others don't move along. So there's an ecosystem issue. And access to energy is definitely an important part of it. I'd like to make two comments in that context. One, the energy industry is getting inspired by the telecom industry. In as much as the telecom industry created this really decentralized business model, the new business model in energy is off-grid, is small grid. It's really getting away from the old-style state monopoly, and that is extremely powerful. When you look at it also, the telecom industry has played a role in that, because to power many of these cell towers, the telecom industry has had to have its own generation capacity and, in a sense, develop their own mini-grid. So that's one aspect. And so I think ensuring that we don't run too fast with one sector if another enabling sector is not coming along. And what I'd like to add is really picking on Rob's S, the services side. I think African government can do much more to put much more content online, to provide more services online, and to make the digital economy a way of doing business for African governments. We need much more demand push, and that, I think, could contribute a lot also to lifting the whole game.
And finally, the other thing we haven't really spoken about, but briefly, can we touch on it, Solomon? The skills that are required. You know, it's what we're teaching children in schools, and it's also what we have to unlearn as the labor force right now.
Something yesterday which is quite interesting. If you look at the amount of open source contribution from the African continent in GitHub, which is a repository for open source, it's actually increased 40% last year, which makes Africa actually the fastest growing contributor in terms of developers and code and so forth. So we are seeing improvement in terms of developers and science and so forth, but we still have a significant gap. That being said, also on the other side of it, even the developers that are being trained and so forth are not getting employment, right? So you see the story with Andela where they had to let go of developers that they have trained, and unfortunately the continent itself does not have the capacity to absorb them. So that's at the higher level, but even in terms of digital literacy, simple digital literacy, so that common people on the roads can consume the services is a big area where we have to work on.
Okay, fantastic. I'd like to open questions to the floor by a show of hands. Who would like to, in fact, let's do this. Please stand up if you have a question. Only women are brave. Only women are ever brave. So, okay, so please keep standing. And then may I also request that Benoit Denis from the European Investment Bank make a submission just by telling us, Benoit, what have we missed in this conversation? And that should also get our creative juices flowing.
Thank you for the panelists for this very interesting discussion. I think you've covered a lot of points. I mean, just a few things. We, the European Investment Bank, we are active in Africa, obviously, but also in the rest of the world. I just want to highlight, even in Europe, we have to structure PPPs to go to the last mile. It's going on at the moment. There's a huge amount of financing that is going there, and I think we are learning a lot from those experiences and replicating outside of Europe. So whenever we put together a good environment, a safe environment for investors to go into those regions, it works. On the French case, the initial plans were to finance by subsidies up to 30% of those networks. In the end, most of the projects that are going on are financed with less than 10% of public subsidies. So there is appetite from the industry and the financiers to go into those projects. So, we'd be very happy to work on that. You had a very interesting set of questions, show of hands at the beginning, and I think there were people expressing some fears. Maybe the thing that we're missing is on cybersecurity. I definitely see that there will be a need for more investments into this field. There is still a lack of awareness of what it means. And linked to that, the whole scope of digitalization of the public sector, because cybersecurity obviously is usually led by the public sector. And the public sector has to evolve to a digital world. We cannot have an economy which is moving to mobile financial services, an economy where agriculture is based on digital, on IoT, but I still have to go and queue for any kind of bill or paying or any kind of paper I have to do. And Pierre, you mentioned, doing business. This is a key element of the doing business ranking, which we hope all African economies are going to evolve towards the top. So cybersecurity, digital transformation of the public sector are two of the points. Maybe we can have a bit of talk.
Thanks so much. I think Pierre did allude to that when he said governments could run better by going onto the digital space. We will all raise the issue of cybersecurity and privacy laws. Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time. My question is actually to the Minister. Your Excellency, when you're looking at 4IR and you understand the trends that need to come and the changes that will happen, the typical way of designing a policy is not going to be efficient. It's not sufficient enough. How apt or how capable or how willing is the continent, or specifically for South Africa, ready to take on innovative sand policy design kind of policy formation?
Shall I go first?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Go
Happy
ahead.
for the lady to go first. But
No, we like your bow tie. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Raj Kulasingham. I had a question. I work for a law firm called Dentons based in London. I had a question on something one of the panelists said about access to capital and how entrepreneurs and young startups are having difficulty finding capital on the continent. And my experience is that that's always the case anywhere you are, but it seems to be more acute in Africa because you don't know where those pools of capital are. My question really is, what could you share with us, including perhaps MTN, others, what they're doing to increase this pool of capital and how we get access to that pool of capital?
Okay, fantastic. And yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I'm the CEO and founder of Uprise Africa, which is the first equity crowdfunding platform in Africa. We have been also recently awarded the best ICT startup in the country. We have joined forces with a stock exchange, which actually means that the startup can be listed on a stock exchange from the very first point and crowd investors can get the liquidity. My question here is to everyone that I think we are doing lots and lots to create the entrepreneurship spirit on the continent. We are doing much which is required, too much, I mean, to create the ecosystem. My question is, what are we doing to break the ecosystems, and what are we doing to create the investment psyche? What are we doing where investment spirit, where investors have those spirit? Because it's more about behaviors, it's more about the courage to take risk on these startups. So when we talk about America, when we talk about Silicon Valley, we actually cannot compare the ecosystem there to African continent. So we have to create our own structures and our own way of changing this investor psyche. So I want to know from all of you, the leaders, that what are we doing for that? Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your questions. Shall we start with the cybersecurity and privacy laws? That's going to be the next big thing to consider.
Touch on it briefly. And in terms of cybersecurity, we actually try to look at it not just from security perspective, but from a holistic perspective. Specifically, in the new age of cloud and AI, you actually need to think through the whole data value chain. Meaning, for example, the algorithms that you're creating, are they fair? Because depending on the type of data set that you use, the machine learning model could be biased to this or that, could discriminate, and so forth. The second part, you're right, is security. How do you secure your data? Where do you store it? How do you share it, and so forth? There's also, a big area that needs attention. The third one is even the models that you create need to be explainable. If a decision is made, right, using a machine learning algorithm, and a financial institution or a banker cannot explain how that decision is made, then there's a problem. So there needs to be that explainability factor. And then the last one is all these decisions need to be also auditable. There needs to be accountability. So we got to look at this new age of AI and cloud from that perspective.
Okay, there was a question to you, Minister, around basically policy innovation.
Well, we do appreciate the fact that, as I said earlier, that we really need to make sure that we have agile policy-making processes, and that's part of those. That's why I said I made an example by the fact that in South Africa we have 18 months. We're talking to that to say, how do we make sure that we can introduce express policies or express laws that can take a period of 3 months, and then we get things going, because what we do not want is to stifle innovation. We want the industry and the innovators to continue doing their work, but we also have a responsibility to protect the people that get to be involved in the work that's being done. So that's what we're trying to work on. Thank you so much.
There was a question about startups, GL, and also MTN. You were mentioned in this one. It's the acute shortage of capital for startups in general, but particularly in Africa, and what could be done to access more money.
I'll take the question that was directed towards the startup ecosystem. I think with venture investing, there's a matter of proximity that has to be addressed. If you're a venture investor, you typically invest maybe 1 part product, but 5 part entrepreneur. And if you're not close to that entrepreneur, it elevates the risk associated with making that deal. It also makes many of the macroeconomic challenges that we recognize all the more scarier, because you're not in market and you don't know how to navigate those things. And I think that's a very realistic concern. But I think having the proximity to the ecosystem if you're going to invest in Nigeria, have a team in Nigeria to make those deals. I think that'll unlock a lot of the hidden opportunities with these entrepreneurs.
GL, I want you to please, at least very briefly, tell us your story. I'm assuming you were born and raised in the United States, and then you launched a startup in Africa. You did not have proximity, but you did it anyway.
Correct. And my motivation for starting Hello Tractor went beyond just immediate financial returns. I actually come from the financial industry, had a pretty good job. And if I was making a decision on a risk-adjusted basis, how to maximize my own personal earnings, I probably would not have started Hello Tractor, if I'm gonna be honest. And so my motivations were a little different, actually very different than a typical investor. I invested my time and capital in Hello Tractor. And so I lacked the proximity to the marketplace, but I had other motivations that fell outside of just maximizing return. But I think for any investor that wants to be successful, I mean, we always talk about Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has the requisite components for the ecosystem. They have strong educational institutions. They have investors in Palo Alto, right? They have everything that you need. They have infrastructure, they have policies, they have everything that you need within that ecosystem to thrive. They build up strong companies and they export technologies from that ecosystem. I think that's something that we're slowly doing in our markets, but that's not with the benefit of the kind of capital that you see in these markets. And that's not unique to Africa. Like, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. If I started a technology company in Cleveland, Ohio, I would be hard pressed to get VC capital. It would be close to impossible. In fact, it's probably easier in Nigeria than it is in Cleveland, Ohio. And so, but I think if we want to be serious about building out these ecosystems, you have to recognize those requisite components in the ecosystem, one of which is local investment, right? So that'd be my
Okay, and then finally, there was a question which you didn't quite touch on, but it was about how then do the startups find the money? If they can't find it through private equity and VCs, could it be the big companies that scale them up, help them to scale up? I think you alluded to that earlier, MTN.
Yeah, I think the point I was making earlier is that we see ourselves as an enabler of that kind of activity. And that's a combination of things like ICT centers for really, people just starting out, opening up in a sandbox environment, our properties. We work a lot with the universities. So we're trying to help stimulate the ecosystem. I think in the end, though, there is a particular kind of capital that chases the return profile of startups. That's not the core business of the telco. So we would do what we can to enable it. Just want to return to the one question earlier on skills, if it's okay. Our experience in the markets now is that the first order problem we have is actually an unemployment problem, not a skills problem. When we advertise for, radio engineers, app developers, people in our core business to run the business across these markets, we are inundated by applications. So it's not so much building more of the skills. Let's, in the first instance, try and stimulate the economies to actually, digest the skills we've got. And one of the big themes, in the plenary session, is the Continental Free Trade Agreement, stimulating trade between African markets, stimulating small businesses. So a lot of what we've spoken about now for the startup environment is around digital businesses. But actually, I think a lot of the capacity to generate employment across the markets is digitally enabled businesses. The small businesses that are going to grow and prosper as we stimulate trade between the markets and as people are more and more connected. And I think that has a much bigger role to play, actually, in the economic recovery of the markets.
Okay, can I get a sense of how many more questions in the room? Please stand up. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And the two here and the three, and that's it. Okay, Jill, I know you've got to leave. The startup's got a meeting with the minister, right? He's getting stuff done. So you shall be excused. I think this is a good time for you to say your goodbyes. Yes, thank you so much for your contributions.
My name is Ali, Managing Director of Ibtikar and Innovation Advisory. So my question is about something we often overlook, which is the mindset. Let's say we invested on connecting people, we invested on educating people. Even Another point which is we often overlook is investing on their mindset. Even if we see some of our communities in Africa, the most connected ones, people are connected, most of them, to chat, to post a picture of their neighbor with their dog, to do things that they are not integrated to the digital economy. How can we invest on them, to do a shift, to invest on the mindset, to have these people read a book, comment on what they did, on value add, on integrating themselves on that local digital economy?
Thank you. My name is Cesar Siwale. If I talk about me, I'll just say props to Olivier, because I've known him since 2014-16 when he was launching his initiative, and it's very, very impressive to see him here up on the stage and how much progress they've made. So a lot of kudos to him and his initiative. The comment I was going to make, and maybe there's a question at the end of it, but and it's something you've touched on, and all of this feels that it's great with all the leapfrogging for Africa, but we seem to forget about the fundamentals and the underlying businesses. And the reality is where a lot of these platforms have been created, that ecosystem, it's got entrepreneurs that are looking for ways to scale up. The fundamentals are pretty decent in all those businesses. We seem to lack that. So whether it was a lack of energy, whether it's not having access to running water, logistics, transportation for goods and services. And I think as we move in from the 2G and accelerating to 4G and 5G, even in this space, you're beginning to see that there are certain basic things that we should be addressing. And I can bet you if you looked in this room, most of us are probably on MTN, Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia, Uganda. Yeah, exactly, Rob. But still today, Europe has now provided open access. There's no need to roam. Why is it in Africa that we're so close together? Zambia or Botswana is not that far from South Africa. Why are we paying these roaming charges when you're talking about this connectivity that's supposed to be happening and the ease of business and dropping costs down? And my worry is just how do we avoid not accelerating this growth and even forgetting addressing the fundamentals within this sector?
Fantastic. Yes, sir. You've got the microphone. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. I had a question for the minister, and that is building on the theme with respect to the importance of policy. Cybersecurity was mentioned, and certainly the rate at which we can adopt modern regulations. I was wondering, Minister, especially in light of the Continental Free Trade being ratified, do you have any examples of where policymakers, ministers across the region have at least one important piece of regulation, whether it's on the data protection side or cybersecurity or something else, that really accelerates tech across the region, where there's a collaborative approach to something that will be harmonized at the continental level?
Thank you.
And if not, why not, please?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Geraldine from Rock Online. There's a lot of talk around the last 10% and the connectivity. And I think a lot of the message was more around the assumption that you needed one machine for every individual, and then this machine also had to be a smartphone of some sort. But I do think that, we have achieved high levels of connectivity. Just to give you an example of our project, the fact that we have a lot of phone numbers attributed to a lot of people around the continent is enough of a data point to connect these people to the world. I mean, we started a project connecting the informal markets of the world through a supplementary digital value chain to the global consumers. And just around Luanda, we were able to ship around 250 products from identifiable market vendors. And we also opened them up to a global market where we were able to ship from identifiable market vendors based on their cell phone numbers, all the way to Australia, to Canada, and now to the UK. So we've opened up a market just using just the phone number without the individual having to even participate physically in the digital process. And so there is a form of doing that with what we have today.
Fantastic. Yes, sir.
Albert Zufak, World Bank Chief Economist for Africa. Two questions, one on the regulatory framework for the digital economy, and the second on the informal economy. On the digital, regulatory framework. My question to the panel is, how do we make sure we avoid the pitfalls of the old economy as we move into the digital world? And let me explain. Let's think of competition. Across Africa, most of the problems we've had in increasing productivity is the fact that competition is not widespread and number of monopolies, be it public or private, actually prevent productivity improvement from happening. How do we make sure we avoid that as we move into the digital economy? Second point also on the regulatory framework. Minister, you mentioned spectrum. What is preventing Africa from allocating spectrum at the regional level? We're all talking about the Continental Free Trade Agreement. How are we linking the digital with the regional market? On the informal economy, I think it's really important. The point that Rob made earlier is fundamental. We'll get a lot of mileage from allowing the digital economy to boost productivity across sector, including in the informal sector. So my question to the panel is, what are those low-hanging fruits in the informal sector that you would see the digital really boosting? Thank you.
Fantastic. Yes, sir.
Chris McLean, Stone Chair Capital. We've all talked about here and we've discussed about how technology can change the mindset. The question I have for the panel is that change top down or bottom up? The sanctity of contract is something that is going to be uniquely available through technology now. It can be preserved. Is that something that to be bottom up from the SME level, or does that need to be top down from contracts and telcos all the way pushed down?
Good afternoon. What are African governments doing to capitalize on big data and across continent actually? And what is being done on regulation with AI and big data?
Fantastic. Let's start with the last one because my fingers couldn't tap fast enough. So what are we doing to capitalize on big data?
Well, as the region, one thing that we had said we must do is to make sure that we develop a data policy for the continent, but we're doing it regionalistic for now. SADC is in that process, and South Africa already is busy with its own. That does not only talk to big data, but also AI. We've even recommended to the heads of states for the establishment of the AI working group that must then look into these matters, the ethics of AI and everything that affects us. And the other question that was asked, what is it that we're doing in terms of roaming? How do we ensure that just like Europe and other regions, that there's free roaming? Of course, as the minister is responsible for digital technologies in the region, SADC, we had tasked our regulators to make sure that they work on that. Therefore, there is work already that's being done. We will be meeting again next year. We also have a platform that we have established as the ministers under the AU, Smart Africa, which is led by the president of Rwanda, whereby we bring all these initiatives together to say this is the way forward for Africa, and therefore different countries, this is what they must do, and as a continent. The other one was in relation to spectrum. What's preventing Africa in licensing spectrum? There's nothing that's preventing us. We are licensing spectrum. Our teams are participating in the World Radio Conference as I'm speaking to you right now. We have established a small team that's looking into Africa in terms of how must we go about the licensing of 5G. As soon as the teams come back from the WRC, I know they'll be coming here to South Africa, then they'll be meeting to say this is the way forward in terms of licensing on 5G. So there's nothing that's preventing us. We are on track. I know we had delayed previously in allocating timelessly, but now we've said with the 5G, we're not going to go through the same thing. On the continental policy on cybersecurity, we don't have one yet. We have under the AU a policy that we've put, actually it's a guideline that we said all countries must adhere to. As a result of that, South Africa came up with the POPI, the Protection of Personal Information Act that we are working on. We had also approved and a cyber bill, a cyber crimes bill in Parliament that's looking into criminalizing cybersecurity and all those. I don't know if there's anything that I think
we've got the bulk of them. Okay, so some other questions that were also asked is the informal economy becomes an important part of stimulating economic activity, and that's where you're going to see some kind of digitization, and it's already happening on a small scale, but how much attention is being paid to the informal economy, where close on to 80% of the unemployed also participate?
A great question. As a matter of fact, I think one of the beauties of this digital economy is that what we used to see as formal versus informal sector is kind of blending. And you see a more or less formal or more or less informal sector. When an informal trader does business or using digital money, that he or she is no longer purely informal. It's partially formalizing things. So I think the digital economy offers a great opportunity to bridge formal and informal. The challenge we have to avoid is to impose the rigidities of the formal sector on the informal sector. So as long as we can keep a dynamic informal sector, give them more and more opportunities without burdening them with excessive regulation, I think that is one of the beauties of the informal economy, of the digital economy and impact on
Back to financial services, bringing people into the financial services without having to open a bank account and doing it through a mobile phone aids that. But then you have a record of it, and it helps a lot of the transparency around transactions. And I think that's a huge piece we talked about earlier, but I wanted to re-stress it, that, that as the informal economy tends to become more formal, it'll still be a huge piece of every country here and in Africa, but I think you'll get the view into what's happening there. And then how do you, with the data policy, and do you have access to that data? We talked a lot about big data earlier, and while I think data lakes and big data is a tough question to answer across boundaries, how do you do it within, and how do you have a policy that may be a same policy across countries, but the barriers are withheld through the border until you figure out the data privacy laws?
There was a question about avoiding the pitfalls of the past, and an example was used as to the difficulty of breaking monopolies, that you don't want to do that going forward. So what are the lessons learned from the past that can be avoided in the future?
I think that if you look at a lot of the theme of this session has been around inclusion. How do we bring people in who are not currently included? And how do we stimulate informal sector small businesses as we try and create jobs across Africa? Now, I think a lot of regulation is not fit for purpose for that discussion. It's one thing to ask for a proof of residence for somebody living here in Sandton. When we go into rural areas across these markets and we're trying to register people for services, that's not really going to work. Small entrepreneurs find the cost and effort of setting up a small business overwhelming. So I think we need to acknowledge that a big part of the growth comes from bringing people into the mainstream who've not been there previously, and that the current system is really not fit for purpose for them. Maybe if I could just touch on one or two of the other things. It was quite a daunting set of questions. There's a question on how do you encourage people to do something useful with their connectivity? Yeah, so that's a very difficult one. My teenagers were teaching me TikTok over the weekend. And I said, isn't it better just to read a book on their Kindle? And they said, no, TikTok's a lot more fun. But I don't really know what economic activity we're going to generate through TikTok. But I guess for us, for operators, we always try not to be sort of too kind of patriarchal about...
Not to you, but to anybody else. I think, if you'll allow me, so I'm going to interpret your question. I think the concern was you have the tools, but you're not really optimizing them. So a simple example I can think of is you have Instagram, and you're posting your holiday in the south of France, when you could be selling a line of makeup or clothes or something on Instagram. You're not using it to the optimum. And it's people having a business mindset. And I don't know how we encourage or harness a business mindset, but it's about really saying to young people, to African people, there's an opportunity in almost everything. Your head must be wired to identify that.
Yeah, it's how we build an entrepreneurial spirit. I guess only contribution I could make is maybe if we made it a lot easier to set up a small business, more people would do it. Because I think there are a lot of good ideas out there. I think final to touch on, just not to, there was a question around the bottom-up versus top-down of the sanctity of contract, which is a little bit about blockchain embedded in there as well. And I think it's very much a combination of both. MTN is in the process of setting up with Orange a company called Mawali, which will do interoperability between mobile money systems. That is being built on blockchain technology, so that's great to see. And in fact, the GSMA is busy with a project to see where we can introduce a blockchain into the roaming traffic between operators, because that's a very traditional, system. So I think the way to tackle it is, from both ends, and I think it really can make a big impact in cost of doing business.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to go back to Albert's question, and you touched on part of it, but Albert positioned that competition policy was one of the biggest challenges in Africa, and I fully agree with that. I think if there's one overarching policy challenge on the continent, is not enough competition. More competition will drive more productivity, will increase opportunities, increase employment, etc. So how does this apply here? Several topics, some of which we've already addressed here. Is one, I really believe we need to move from national mindsets to regional and continental mindset, to open up markets and create increased competition that way. Second, the digital economy, what does it mean? Digital economy means that the old sectoral industry silos are being broken down. That if you have Uber, well, that's transport, or is it ICT? If you have mobile money, is it banking or is it telecom? So the same way in connectivity, you have over-the-top provider, OTTs, you have a number of new players in the game that have different ways of coming in. So somehow, I think we'll need to move gradually from very narrow, siloed sector regulation to more comprehensive competition policy that helps create markets and that can adapt to how technology is changing markets, because the markets of today are not those of the 20th century.
On the comment about phone numbers, because I think it's actually a really, really great point, because what that's, the comment is speaking about is about data sets that already exist and are not being utilized at all. And that's also related to policy. I can give you a very simple example. For example, almost every African country has something called district health survey, right? So it's something that's done, I think, every 3-4 years or so. Yes, the data set is not clean, and unfortunately, the data sets over the last 15-20 years is just sitting. And what we have done is actually looked at the data set, curated it, and all of a sudden, by applying AI, which ties to the point that we just made here, we're finding some very, very interesting trends about, be it maternal health, newborn child, malaria, and so forth, right? Now, because of this data sets and because we looked into it, people thought it was trash, all of a sudden we're seeing commonalities between Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, and other 10 or so countries, right? So what does this mean? Now this talks about harmonization and policy making, right? Okay. Out of this now, you can actually utilize artificial intelligence itself to help policymakers make better policy.
Okay, so we've literally got 5 minutes till the end of the session. I'd like us to do it in less than 5 minutes. So TV rules apply. It's a soundbite I'm looking for. Minister, Africa's readiness to participate in the 4IR by 2025. Are we there yet?
Yes, we are there. That's why we spoke about the coordinated approach that we're taking as the African states. Therefore, coming invest in Africa, I've already highlighted earlier the area of infrastructure, which is key, the area of technology that must be introduced, but you put a very important point of people-centered approach, making sure that we skill the people. So we are there. Just partner with us. We're the best continent to invest in.
Solomon Asefa, Africa's readiness to participate in the 4IR by 2025.
I think so far we've been very successful in talking about it. I think we need to be acting much more. We need to be building skills. We need to understand the data sets that we already are sitting on, and we need to really understand what, the tool sets that exist and how we utilize them.
Gary Schneider?
I think there's great momentum. I think there's a lot to learn from other countries. We didn't talk about digital identity, and that's what came up with the phone. I think that's the foundational piece that will help create the momentum to bring people in.
Rob Schutter?
I think it creates a massive opportunity because the adoption of new technologies, bringing people into the connected world, unlocking the potential of Africa with all its attributes, I think is going to be generate great returns, in fact, over the next 5 years. And finally, the 4IR is here today. It's just not evenly distributed.
Pierre Ghislain?
So we are a bank, the African Development Bank. Digital economy is one of our priorities. We'd like more of our clients, whether they're governments or private sector companies, to come to us and ask for financing to help develop this opportunity.
And you, the audience, how many of you are feeling better about the 4IR and 2025? So basically you're saying we didn't help you. How many of you feel helped by this panel? Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.